There's something deeply telling about a moment when the world's two largest economies simultaneously reject the same warning, not because they agree with each other, but because both have calculated that the cost of acknowledging it is higher than the cost of ignoring it. That's where we are today. Xi Jinping's implicit cautions about escalation in Ukraine have been brushed aside by Washington with familiar dismissiveness, and Beijing itself has walked back any suggestion that it holds leverage it isn't using. What you're watching isn't a diplomatic miscommunication, it's a choreographed performance, and the stage directions were written long before any of us saw the curtain rise. Stay with me, because by the end of this, the thing you thought was a rejection will reveal itself as something far more calculated and far more dangerous. Let's begin with what the headlines are actually telling you, because the surface reading is almost designed to mislead. The framing in mainstream Western media is essentially this: Xi warned Trump about something related to Ukraine, Trump rejected it, China denied the framing, and now we move on to the next news cycle. Neat, clean, forgettable. But the moment you ask why both sides are denying the same exchange, you've already started pulling at a thread that unravels the entire narrative architecture that's been built around this war. The Ukraine conflict from the very beginning was never simply about Ukraine. I know that sounds like the kind of thing people say when they want to appear contrarian, but bear with me, because the evidence isn't subtle once you know where to look. Ukraine became the physical theater for a much older geopolitical contest, one that predates Zelensky, predates Putin's second or third act, and even predates the post-Cold War expansion debates of the 1990s. What we're really watching is the terminal phase of a unipolar world order struggling to maintain its coherence while a multipolar reality is already forming around it, and China sits at the very center of that forming reality. Now, here's the critical realization I want you to hold in your mind as we go deeper. I'll fully unpack it in the final third of this conversation, but plant it now. The fact that both Washington and Beijing are rejecting the same warning tells you something profound about the nature of the current negotiation, because in geopolitics, when two adversaries independently deny the same thing, it usually means the thing is true, and both sides have agreed, tacitly, that acknowledging it would shift the balance of leverage in ways neither can afford. That's not coincidence, that's coordination through denial. To understand why Xi's position even matters in the Ukraine context, we have to look at what China has actually been doing since February 2022, not what it's been saying, because Beijing has been extraordinarily careful to maintain what I'd call strategic ambiguity, present enough to matter, distant enough to deny culpability. China did not sanction Russia. China expanded its energy imports from Russia, effectively replacing the European revenue stream that Western sanctions were designed to cut off. Chinese companies, through third-party channels in Central Asia and the Gulf, continued supplying components that ended up in Russian industrial and military supply chains. And Beijing offered Russia something perhaps more valuable than hardware. It offered diplomatic legitimacy on the world stage, showing up at forums, maintaining bilateral summits, refusing to treat Russia as a pariah. None of this is secret. It's documented. But the mainstream conversation rarely connects these dots into their logical conclusion, which is that China has been a silent co-belligerent in this conflict, not in the sense of sending troops or weapons directly, but in the deeper strategic sense of ensuring that Russia could absorb the economic shock of Western isolation long enough to keep fighting. And if China has been doing all of that, then when Xi makes any kind of statement about Ukraine, whether it's framed as a warning, a suggestion, or a diplomatic nudge, it carries the weight of someone who has been holding a critical piece of the chessboard the whole time without anyone officially acknowledging it. This is where Trump's rejection becomes fascinating rather than predictable, because Trump is not a traditional foreign policy actor. He operates on the logic of the deal. Everything is a negotiation, every relationship is transactional, and every public statement is either an opening bid or a closing play. When the Trump administration waves away Xi's framing on Ukraine, they're not dismissing China's relevance to the conflict. That would be geopolitically illiterate, and whatever you think of Trump's style, the people around him understand leverage. What they're doing instead is refusing to give China the public credit for holding that leverage, because to do so would be to acknowledge that the resolution of the Ukraine war runs through Beijing, and that acknowledgement would fundamentally reframe America's role from primary architect of the peace to one party among several. Ask yourself this: why would the most transactional president in American history turn down a potential diplomatic win that he could have packaged as only Trump could get China to the table? The answer to that question tells you everything about the real constraints operating beneath the surface of this conflict. Part of the answer lies in the domestic political architecture of the United States right now. Trump's coalition, whatever its contradictions, is bound together by a particular story about American strength, a story in which America wins, America leads, and America does not share credit with adversaries. Giving Xi a visible role in brokering or shaping the Ukraine outcome would rupture that narrative at a moment when Trump needs his base energized and unified. So the rejection of Xi's framing isn't primarily a foreign policy decision. It's a domestic political calculation wearing a foreign policy costume. And that, right there, is one of the most dangerous dynamics in modern geopolitics. When domestic political theater begins to constrain actual strategic decision-making in ways that the actors themselves may not fully recognize. But to understand why this matters beyond the immediate news cycle, we have to look at the structural shift that's been happening in Eurasian geopolitics over the past 3 to 4 years, because Ukraine is not just a war, it's an accelerant. It has accelerated processes that were already underway. The de-dollarization of bilateral trade between Russia and China, the expansion of BRICS as an institutional alternative to Western financial architecture, the reorientation of Central Asian supply chains away from dependence on Western-controlled systems, and perhaps most importantly, the psychological shift in the Global South's relationship to Western institutions and Western narratives. Before February 2022, many governments in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia still operated within a mental framework where aligning with Washington was the default safe option. That framework has cracked, not because these governments suddenly became anti-American, most of them are not, but because they watched what happened to Russia's foreign reserves, they watched the weaponization of the SWIFT system, and they quietly asked themselves, if this can happen to a G8 nation, what does this mean for us? That question has been driving an enormous amount of quiet hedging behavior across the developing world, and China has been the primary beneficiary. And here's where Xi's position on Ukraine becomes truly strategic rather than merely diplomatic. China doesn't need Ukraine to end tomorrow. In fact, there's a credible argument that a prolonged, managed conflict in Ukraine serves Chinese interests by keeping American attention, American resources, and American political capital tied up in Europe, while China consolidates its position in Asia, in Africa, in the Pacific, and in the emerging institutional architecture of the multipolar order. Every month that Washington is focused on Ukraine is a month that Beijing has relative freedom of maneuver elsewhere. So when Xi issues what gets characterized as a warning, we need to ask, a warning to whom and about what? Because the surface reading, that Xi is concerned about escalation, perhaps nuclear escalation, is probably accurate as far as it goes. China genuinely does not want a nuclear exchange in Europe. That much is clear from every serious analysis of Chinese strategic doctrine. But the deeper message embedded in whatever communication happened between Beijing and Washington is likely something more nuanced. China is signaling that it exists in this equation, that it has influence over variables that America cannot fully control, and that any sustainable resolution will require acknowledging that reality. The rejection from Washington and the subsequent denial from Beijing suggests that neither side is ready to formalize that acknowledgement, but both sides know it's true. Now let's talk about what's actually happening on the ground in Ukraine, because the military reality has a way of clarifying diplomatic postures in ways that political speeches never quite manage. The situation as of mid-2025 is one of exhaustion dressed up as stalemate. Ukrainian forces have been fighting with extraordinary courage and resilience, but the arithmetic of attrition has been brutal. Western military aid, while substantial, has not been sufficient to produce the kind of decisive breakthrough that would shift the fundamental military balance. Russia, meanwhile, has absorbed the shock of Western sanctions better than most Western analysts predicted, partly because of the Chinese economic lifeline, partly because the Russian domestic economy adapted more rapidly than expected, and partly because the sanctions regime itself had enough leaks to prevent the kind of complete isolation that would have been necessary to force a collapse. What this means is that the war has entered a phase where everyone, including the parties in Kyiv and Moscow, can see that the trajectory does not lead to a clean military victory for either side. What it leads to instead is a negotiated settlement of some kind, at some point, under some set of conditions that no one has yet been willing to publicly articulate, because the domestic political costs of doing so are, for every actor involved, still considered too high. And this is where I want you to really think about what's at stake here, because I think this is a question worth sitting with. What does it mean for a generation of Ukrainians who were promised that resistance would be met with the full backing of the Western world, when the actual trajectory of that backing has been calibrated not by Ukrainian strategic needs but by the domestic political cycles of American, German, French, and British politics? That gap between promise and reality is not just a moral question, it's a strategic one, because the credibility of Western security guarantees is a finite resource, and it is being spent in ways that future allies and partners are watching very carefully. But to understand the full depth of the China dimension here, we have to look at something that almost never gets discussed in mainstream coverage of this conflict, and that is the economic relationship between China and the European Union, which has been quietly transforming even as the war rages. Europe, particularly Germany, found itself in an extraordinarily uncomfortable position after 2022. It had weaponized economic interdependence as a tool against Russia, but in doing so, it had exposed its own vulnerability to the same kind of logic. And China, watching this, began slowly and methodically reducing its own exposure to Western financial and technological dependencies, not through dramatic decoupling announcements, but through the patient, incremental work of building alternatives. The result is that, by the time Xi is supposedly issuing warnings about Ukraine, China has already done much of the structural work to insulate itself from the worst consequences of a major Western-Chinese confrontation. That's not recklessness, that's preparation. And preparation of that kind takes years, which means the decisions driving it were made long before the current headlines, which raises a question I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts on in the comments. Do you think the current American political leadership has a strategic time horizon that matches the challenge it's facing from Beijing? Or is the incentive structure of two-year election cycles fundamentally incompatible with the kind of long-range strategic thinking that this moment actually demands? Now, let me bring in the Trump factor more specifically, because I think Trump's approach to both China and Ukraine simultaneously is one of the more genuinely interesting geopolitical puzzles of this period. On one hand, Trump has been more openly skeptical of the Ukraine commitment than any major Western leader, which has created real anxiety in Kyiv and in Brussels. On the other hand, Trump has maintained and in some cases escalated economic pressure on China through tariffs and technology restrictions. These two positions seem contradictory on the surface, skeptical of the war that most directly challenges Russian power, but hawkish toward China, which benefits from Russian resilience. But they're actually coherent within Trump's own transactional logic. Trump's calculation, as best I can reconstruct it, is essentially this: Ukraine is a cost center that yields diminishing political and strategic returns for America, and he wants to exit that cost center while claiming some version of a deal as a win. China, on the other hand, is a long-term economic competitor, and maintaining pressure on China is both strategically defensible and domestically popular across the American political spectrum in a way that very few other foreign policy positions are. So Trump is trying to do two things at once: reduce America's exposure in Ukraine while not reducing America's competitive posture toward China. The problem is that these two objectives are not as separable as they appear, because China's role in sustaining Russian capacity in Ukraine means that any Ukraine deal will implicitly involve some degree of accommodation with Chinese interests, and Trump cannot publicly admit that without destabilizing the second half of his strategy. This is the bind. And it's why the rejection of Xi's warning and Xi's own denial of having issued it is actually a perfectly rational response from both sides to a situation where the honest accounting of the geopolitical reality would cost both leaders more than they're willing to pay in political terms right now. Here's another question I want to pose to you, and I mean this genuinely, because I've had conversations with people across the political spectrum who land in very different places on this. Do you believe that a negotiated settlement in Ukraine that involved Chinese mediation or Chinese guarantees would be more or less durable than a settlement brokered purely through Western institutions? Because the answer to that question has enormous implications not just for Ukraine but for the entire architecture of international order going forward. Let me turn now to the thing I told you to hold in the back of your mind: the critical realization about what it means when both Washington and Beijing reject the same warning. Because now that we've laid out the full context, the implication becomes much clearer and, I would argue, much more alarming. When two great powers simultaneously deny the same diplomatic reality, it usually means one of two things. Either the exchange didn't happen in the way it's been described, which is always possible in a media environment that frequently gets the details of high-level diplomatic communication wrong, or the exchange did happen, and both sides have independently calculated that denying it serves their immediate interests better than acknowledging it. If the second scenario is true, and I think the weight of circumstantial evidence points in that direction, then what you're actually looking at is a situation where the two most powerful nations on Earth are engaged in a covert negotiation about the future of a major European conflict, while the nation actually being fought over and the continent it sits in are largely excluded from the real conversation. That's not paranoia, that's geopolitics as it has actually functioned for centuries. The powerful negotiate the terms, the less powerful live with the results. What's changed in the modern era is the addition of media complexity, the need to manage not just the negotiation itself, but the public narrative around it, because democratic publics in America and semi-authoritarian systems in China both have their own constraints and their own pressure points that leaders must navigate. The denial in this reading isn't dishonesty in the conventional moral sense. It's narrative management, a sophisticated form of political stagecraft that allows the actual conversation to continue while protecting both leaders from the domestic political cost of being seen to negotiate with an adversary on terms that might look like weakness. And this is where it connects to something larger that I think about a great deal, which is the question of what international moral order we are actually living in right now, because the post-World War II framework, the United Nations, the international court systems, the rules-based order that Washington so frequently invokes, has been revealed by the Ukraine conflict to be selectively applied in ways that have badly eroded its legitimacy in the eyes of much of the world. When the International Criminal Court issues an arrest warrant for Putin and the same court's jurisdiction is contested by the United States when it comes to American or Israeli actions, the message that lands in the global south is not rules-based order. The message that lands is order for thee, not for me. And China has been extraordinarily effective at exploiting that perception gap, not by building a better alternative system, but simply by pointing at the contradiction and letting it do its work. The reason this matters for the sea warning story is that China's ability to position itself as a potential peace broker in Ukraine, even if that positioning is itself a strategic play, depends entirely on the perception that it is more honest about its interests than the Western powers have been about theirs. Whether or not that perception is accurate is almost beside the point. Perception in geopolitics is reality, at least until events force a correction. So, where does this leave us? What is the actual trajectory here? And what should a thoughtful American who is watching all of this make of it? Here is what I think the honest accounting looks like. The Ukraine conflict is moving, slowly and painfully, towards some form of negotiated outcome, not because anyone has chosen peace, but because the military and economic math is forcing it. That negotiated outcome will involve territorial compromises that will be politically difficult to sell in the West and potentially devastating for Ukrainian sovereignty in ways that were never honestly disclosed to the Ukrainian public when they were being encouraged to resist. The shape of that deal will be influenced significantly by what China is willing to do or not do, whether it maintains its economic support for Russia, whether it applies pressure through back channels, and whether it is willing to offer any form of security guarantee or institutional framework that gives a settlement durability. And through all of this, the public discourse in America will continue to be shaped by a media and political environment that has strong incentives to simplify, to moralize, and to avoid the kinds of uncomfortable admissions that the actual situation demands. The rejection of Xi's warning is, in that sense, a microcosm of the entire problem, a real dynamic being managed away from public view, replaced by a simpler story that protects the political interests of the people telling it. My final question for you, and I want to see your honest answers in the comments, because I think this community is capable of a level of analysis that goes well beyond what you'll find in the mainstream conversation. But is this: at what point does the management of the public narrative about Ukraine become not just a political inconvenience, but an actual strategic liability? Because there is a threshold at which the gap between what leaders are telling their publics and what is actually happening becomes so wide that it undermines the capacity for democratic societies to make informed decisions about the commitments they're being asked to sustain. And I would argue, watching the Xi story get simultaneously rejected and denied from both Washington and Beijing, that we are very close to that threshold, if we haven't already crossed it. The chessboard is real. The players know where the pieces are. The question is whether the people watching the game are ever going to be allowed to see the actual board.